Welcome to Lecture 21. Lecture 21 is the first lecture in the final exam section. That's for exam number 3. We didn't have a Lecture 20. That was essentially the exam for the last week. So we're doing a little bit of catch-up here, but we are starting exam unit number 3 with the first lecture on prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. And one question for you to consider as you're thinking about this material is, which is more harmful in your opinion, stereotyping or discrimination? And it's important to understand the definitions of those terms in order to give a sensible answer. A couple of announcements and reminders to begin with. Remember that there is a study guide for exam number 3, just like there was for the last 2 exams. And if you haven't tried it already, consider studying the terms each week or lecture by lecture rather than only using it right before the exam. Also, earlier in the course, I posted a code of conduct just for you to consider anytime you're discussing things with classmates about prejudice and discrimination or other sensitive topics. The code of conduct can come in handy for having a productive dialogue. Before we get into the material on prejudice and discrimination and stereotyping, I'd like to make a brief segue to essentially what is the same kind of thing you'll be doing for your paper, but done by a professional, in fact, one of the authors of your textbook. So what Bob Cialdini has done is applied social psychology research and theory to solve a social problem. So just briefly, what we're talking about here is Bob Cialdini noticed that at hotels, people are frequently asked to limit their use of the laundry, in particular to avoid wasting resources when it comes to asking for fresh towels and washcloths and whatnot. The approach typically encountered is to have some sort of message in your hotel room that reads something like, millions of people waste resources by using fresh towels when they don't need to, so please consider doing otherwise. The problem, as Bob Cialdini saw it, is that those kinds of messages described for people what was normal behavior. It provided a descriptive norm, and that descriptive norm, if people conformed to it, would lead to a continuation of that problem. So he suggested the alternative approach, which is to say the majority of our guests choose to conserve resources by reusing their towels. Now, if people conformed to that majority, if they wanted to change their behavior to be consistent with that message, then that actually would lead to a reduction in the amount of laundry used. And so they randomly assigned hotels to one of those 2 messages, and what they found in their study was that there was actually a significantly higher number of guests who reused towels with that alternative message. The full story is found there at that URL, so you can type that in and get a sense of it. It's pretty entertaining and interesting application of social psychology research and theory to solving a social problem. Now, on to the material for today, which is about prejudice, how we can be biased towards one another, what the sources of that bias can be, and how that translates into social behavior. So before we begin, let's talk to Albert Einstein. Our physicist friend and social psychologist, Albert Einstein, said common sense is a collection of prejudices acquired by age 18. And the reason I like this is not because Albert Einstein is a social psychologist by any stretch of the imagination. However, he does point out some important things here. First of all, prejudice can feel like common sense. It's common and it's sensible because lots of people around us teach us that this is the normal way to behave, it's the normal way to perceive other groups. So it's common sense in the sense that a lot of people hold it as true, or a lot of people hold it as sensible behavior or sensible beliefs. The collection means that we get these prejudices from many different sources as we're growing up. And then the last part there, that we acquire it by age 18, is just sort of reminding us that we are not born prejudiced, but instead, as we are growing up through socialization in a particular group or set of groups around us, we learn these things, and by the time we emerge as a young adult, we've actually collected a number of these common sense prejudices along the way. So good job, Albert Einstein. We'll allow you into the Social Psychology Club for making such a sensible quote. All right, now let's think about Irishmen. Irishmen are as a social group. Throughout America's history, Irish people have been immigrants in the United States. And so let's think about three different ways of perceiving Irishmen. First, let's think about how we feel about them. I'd like you to, just for yourself, make a note on a piece of note paper there. Think of the extent to which you dislike them, so that would be a rating on 1 or 2 or something like that, or how much you like Irishmen in general, somewhere up in the rating of 6 or 7, or if you're undecided, maybe it's somewhere in the 4 range for you. Now I would like you to think about 3 things that you think or believe about Irishmen, some things that you think are true about Irish people. Okay? And then lastly, I would ask you the question, would you discourage your sister from marrying an Irishman? It's often hard for people to be honest about stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination, and perhaps that is because there's a lot of debate in society about what's okay, what's not okay. People talk about what's politically correct. As society evolves, we try to discourage people from having prejudices and discrimination and holding stereotypes, but nonetheless, they're out there. And so I picked this group because it's often one that we don't think too much about. You don't see people commenting a lot about Irishmen in the newspaper anymore, or in the news media. So think of these 3 different pieces that we've just looked at here. We have a feeling about Irishmen, we have beliefs about Irishmen, and then at least an intention of behavior here. If you are agreeing that you might discourage your sister from marrying an Irishman, or maybe you are the opposite of that and you would encourage your sister to marry an Irishman, these are both kind of behavioral intentions. And we'll return to these ideas in a moment. So the overall outline for this chapter, and we'll have 2 lectures on this, is we kind of first think about the characteristics of our world, the broader sense of prejudice in the world. We'll make some relevant definitions and distinctions and look at some research that is focused on those kinds of issues. And then we'll talk more about the sort of theoretical side of things, what sorts of motivations, what sorts of processes, psychological processes underlie prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. And then finally we'll wrap up with talking about some ways of reducing prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. So as we're thinking about planet prejudice, just starting with an overview here, think about how society has changed since your parents' generation or even in your own lifetime. Survey evidence, broad social science surveys of the United States and people's attitudes towards intergroup relations suggest that over time, since say the 50s in the United States, people have become more tolerant of other groups and more accepting. However, some people also argue, social psychologists argue, that although it has become less popular to be overtly or openly racist or sexist, people instead use racist kinds of statements in more subtle kinds of ways. So this is sometimes referred to as modern or symbolic racism or benevolent sexism. And so just kind of think about, yes, it's become unpopular in many ways to be racist or sexist, but at the same time it still exists and maybe expresses in more subtle forms. And this URL here that I've highlighted actually shows a KKK Klans member riding on a bus to a rally. And so it is still out there, and people sometimes are emboldened to engage in these kinds of behaviors. But probably a better way to think of prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination is that it's more subtle in its manifestation these days. But nonetheless, it's still quite profound. It has a strong and deep impact on those people that are targeted by such things. So let's clarify some general terms. It's important, as you know, for social psychologists to be very specific in the kinds of things that they're talking about. It helps them conduct their research in a careful manner and helps them interpret their research findings in a careful manner. So stereotyping. By stereotyping, we're talking about the thoughts or cognitions and beliefs that people have about members of a social group. So going back to our example about the Irish, when I asked you what beliefs you had about Irish people, are they do they tend to drink a lot, for example? If you believe that to be true, that's part of the stereotype. It's a thought or belief that you have about Irish people. Okay. Maybe you also have the belief that they fight a lot, or that they are happy-go-lucky. Who knows what your cognitions or thoughts are about Irish people. Prejudice has to do with the feelings about members of a social group. So when I asked you whether you disliked or liked Irishmen, I was asking you about your prejudgments, your feelings and evaluations about members of that social group Irishmen. Discrimination are behaviors biased towards a member of a social group. And it could be a positive discrimination or it could be a negative discrimination. Generally, we talk about negative discrimination. So if you said, well, I'm not going to let my sister marry an Irishman, I'd much rather she marry an Englishman or an African American. Who knows what you would prefer, but if you're biased against your sister marrying an Irish person, that would be a discrimination. So if we kind of tie all three of these things together, you might say, for example, well, I believe that many Irishmen are drunkards. They get drinking too much, and they fight, and they're not very kind or polite to their family members. So I don't like them for that reason. I'm wary of them. I'm cautious about interacting with them. And I wouldn't want my sister to marry that kind of guy. So kind of going from our stereotypes to our feelings to our behaviors, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, they're all linked together. So when we think about planet prejudice, let's begin by thinking of some characteristics of groups, social groups, or social animals like pit bulls, New Yorkers, hockey fans, feminists, etc. When we talk about characteristics that belong with a certain group that in our mind, these are stereotypes, generalized beliefs about the characteristics of a group, those characteristics that define most, if not all, of the members of that group for us. So these generalized beliefs guide our expectations about members of those social groups. So when we think about what a typical New Yorker is, when we encounter a New Yorker, we kind of will expect that New Yorker has at least most of the characteristics that are typical of New Yorkers. And these thoughts about the characteristics that are likely to define these individuals could influence us to have particular feelings, okay, standard feelings about a particular group, and that would be our prejudice. And it may in turn affect our behavior towards those groups, which would be the discrimination. So maybe you've had some personal experience where you were the object of some negative feelings based simply on the group that you belong to. Sometimes it occurs in a positive way, but when people have these feelings about you and they're not based on your individual characteristics, but instead based on some characteristics that people believe you to have because of some group that you belong to, then that's prejudice. When you have a generalized attitude or feeling towards members of a social group. One that most of us have encountered is feelings that people have are based on our membership in being young. For example, a teenager, or even young adulthood. Sometimes older people will look at members of a teenage group or look at members of a young adult group and have certain beliefs or feelings associated with those beliefs. Beliefs, of course, are the stereotype component, but they can also have feelings. Like, for example, if they are looking at a teenager, they might think that a teenager is irresponsible, and then they feel somewhat nervous, somewhat reluctant to give that teenager responsibility. Okay? Or maybe you've walked into a store and people have been monitoring you or monitoring your behavior because they're afraid that you might steal something because you're a teenager. Okay? So evaluations, negative evaluations based on membership in a social group. When we talk about prejudice, we're talking about actual behaviors that people engage in that are linked to their thoughts, their stereotypes, or their feelings. And I'm sorry, this is prejudice. These are feelings still, not discrimination yet. So we can have explicit prejudice. These are positive or negative feelings which a person is aware of. Like, I really don't like those people. Or it could be implicit prejudice. These are feelings that a person might not be entirely aware of. So if you find yourself sitting on a school bus and someone sits down to you that's from a different group and you feel a little bit uncomfortable, you're not quite sure why, or if you're in a doctor's office and you're waiting and someone sits down next to you that's different, and you feel yourself being uncomfortable but you're not quite entirely sure why, that could be implicit prejudice. Whereas if you actually know that you dislike the person because of their social group, that's explicit prejudice. So if you were looking at the study guide for exam number 3, you might see that one of the things that you're expected to do is distinguish stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, also to distinguish between explicit and implicit forms of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So just a highlight there that the study guide is relevant to our slides and our texts and readings. So be sure to be following along and learning that material as you go along. All right, so here's some research that shows the subtle expression of bigoted views. Participants in this study were asked to judge white and black applicants for university admission. So the application packets were identical. Okay, that's important to remember. They were identical except for a photograph that was attached, which either was a white applicant or a black applicant. So the participants did not discriminate when the applicants' test scores, grades, etc. were consistently strong or consistently weak. So if we had a white and black applicant that had a very consistent and strong application, then there was no discrimination. People admitted the white and black applicants at the same rate. If they were consistently weak, then they didn't admit them at roughly the same rate. However, on the following slide, you'll see that discrimination emerged when the applicants' credentials were mixed or ambiguous. They weren't quite sure what they should do with regards to admission. Should they let the person in or should they not let the person in? When it was a little bit hard to tell, that's when we saw prejudice emerging. Prejudice and discrimination, because here people are making decisions that have an impact. Okay, so the strength of recommendation for admission from 1 barely recommend to admit to 4 highly recommend for the white and black applicants. You can see that for non-prejudiced participants, these are people who earlier in the experiment had taken a measure of prejudice and showed that there wasn't really any strong indication of prejudice. For those people, if anything, they showed a reverse pattern, okay, favoring the black applicant. But those who were highly prejudiced for these ambiguous applications showed a very strong pattern of discrimination that favored white applicants and disfavored black applicants. So there's a prejudgment here, but also because there's a decision about whether a person should be admitted to university or not, you can see that this is also leaning towards the discrimination side of things. On the following slide, I'll show another study that it's not highlighted in your text. I don't have a reading for it, but I'll give you some details. And the main thing that's important here is that, like this study we just looked at, there wasn't clear discrimination, wasn't clear prejudice when the evidence was strongly in favor or strongly against, but it really was in that situation where it was mixed that the prejudice emerged and the discrimination emerged. So what we have in this study is 3 court cases. Those 3 court cases were either presenting weak evidence against the person, or strong evidence against the person, or marginal or mixed evidence against the person. So 3 different levels of evidence against the person. The culpability or guilt ratings range from 1, not at all guilty, to 36, absolutely guilty. And let's first just look at the rows, or these columns here. We find that when the evidence is weak, people are more likely to say, no, we're not going to convict this person, not guilty, kind of down on the 1 side of things. And when the evidence is strong, people are more likely to say, yes, let's convict this person, up towards the 30 side of things. And it's kind of in the middle, near the 15 or 18, when the evidence is mixed. But it's important to look at the rows here also, because the rows are signifying a different part of the experiment. Same scenarios, same evidence, but the defendant is presented as African American or European American. And what we find is that even though there's a trend towards convicting the African American or being more guilty for the African American, we see that in this total here across the row, 15 as opposed to 13. Really the strongest effect is what I've highlighted here in yellow, and that is that when the evidence was marginal or mixed, people seem to be using their stereotypes to be more in favor of conviction for the African American defendant as opposed to the European American defendant. One last bit of research evidence that I think is really interesting, and actually I have a couple of links here for you to check it out, and I think I have a extra credit question on the final exam, on the 3rd exam, and so I've posted the research article, Correll et al. 2007, on the website, Blackboard website, as an optional reading. But so here's a social problem. The social problem is the influence of stereotype in law enforcement decisions. So conceivably, a person who's in law enforcement may be biased towards some groups than others in split-second decisions that they have to make about law enforcement. So in this photograph you see right here on the slide, there's an African American man and he's holding something in his right hand. Now what is that something? If you're a police officer and you have to make a quick decision about protecting yourself or protecting other people, you need to decide something like, is that a wallet? Is that a cell phone? Is that a gun? And those kinds of questions might be influenced by stereotypes, expectations that people have about members of social groups. So this study was designed to help address the question whether or not police officers, 1, can make mistakes that are driven by stereotypes, and 2, can they be trained to avoid making those kinds of mistakes. Now to see if you might be susceptible to similar kinds of biases, you can go to this website here to try an online version of the experiment that was driven by this original research study. The main thing that they conclude in that study is that police officers can make these kinds of mistakes, but if they're trained well, they make those kinds of mistakes less often than the average member of the public. So let's continue with this idea of planet prejudice. Just how much of it is there out there? Think about yourself or think about close friends, and think about whether or not anyone in your group of friends, in your circle of family or friends, has been denied a job or promotion based on some group membership that they belong to. Maybe they've been insulted or harassed because of that. Maybe it's they've been ignored or poorly served in a restaurant or other businesses. Maybe they haven't been able to get an apartment or a house based on these kinds of things. Now, much of this is illegal, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And as I said, one group that we all belong to and has probably been the subject of some kind of prejudice and discrimination is being a teenager. And so when you're sitting in a restaurant trying to be served, you're probably not going to get quite as good a service as a person who is older and appears to have more money. So here is an example of discrimination. Discrimination, and this is a research study. This same person, at Walmart, there's always a job available. They're always seeking applicants. And this set of experimenters sent this Confederate, this young lady, to Walmart to submit an application, and she was randomly assigned to wear one or the other hat. She didn't know what hat she was wearing when she went in to drop off her resume. And you can check the details of this study in your book. And the dependent variable for this study was the number of callbacks for a job. And as you might suspect, the lady on the right here received less callbacks for a job than the lady on the left. So that would be an example of, considering she submitted the same applications to the same corporation, the only thing that differed was her hat. My suspicion is, and the interpretation of the researchers, is that the discrimination made itself apparent by her not getting as many callbacks for employment as this person here. We also see negative evaluations and expectations of behavior playing out in terms of sexual harassment and gender discrimination. Many high school students, and although this is an older study, it's still a problem today, report having been sexually harassed. In addition, the U.S. Army spent many millions of dollars a year related to sexual harassment. We've just had in Alaska here some controversy about how the Coast Guard has dealt with cases of sexual harassment. So it's definitely still very much a part of the landscape out there for women and men alike. And it's not just women who get sexually harassed. But there are some important gender features here. Men are generally more likely to harass than are women, but whether men harass or not depends partially on the man and partially on the situation. So what we're talking about here is an interaction. There's some characteristics of men that influence whether or not they'll harass, but there's also characteristics of the situation that influence when they harass or to what extent. And in this study that we're going to report in the next couple of slides here, what you see is what we call an interaction, a combination of the personality characteristics of these male students and the situation characteristics that they found themselves in, and how that combines to contribute to an increase in sexual harassment behavior. So these men who were participants in the study were introduced to a female trainee. They were told that they were going to teach a person to do some keyboarding, basic keyboard skills, and they were introduced to the female trainee by a male graduate student who acted in one of two different ways, depending on random assignment. They acted in a sexist kind of way, where the graduate student who introduced the trainee put his arm around the trainee and visually checked out her body. Or the person who was introducing the trainee acted in a very professional way and was respectful of the trainee and did not have any sexual overtones to the interaction. Now, what happens next is interesting. The dependent variable in the research study was the amount of sexuality expressed by the male student while instructing the female trainee in the word processing task. And the results depended upon the participant's chronic disposition to harass. So far we've introduced one variable, and that is the behavior of the person introducing the trainee. So that behavior was either sexist or professional. Okay, so that's the situational influence. And before the young men who were participating in this entered that situation, that they actually had completed a questionnaire that assessed their chronic disposition or typical disposition to harass. And they could be divided into people who were more likely to harass and people who were less likely to harass. What we see on the next slide is the results of this study. So keep in mind that the y-axis here is the amount of sexuality or sexual innuendo in the physical contact with the trainee. So down here we have the pre-measure of the research participants' disposition to harass. Those people in the light-colored bar here, the light blue, were unlikely or less likely to harass as just a general character principle, whereas those in the red were those who, through their questionnaire responses, indicated that they were more likely to harass or have sexual harassment kinds of interactions with women. So what we see here on the left is an indication that when a person is introduced in a professional manner, when the role model that's introducing the female trainee behaves in a professional manner, there's a minor little difference between those who are chronically more likely to harass and those who are less likely to harass. But most of the main message here is that there's not much sexuality in their interactions with the trainee. On the other hand, when there is a sexist introduction to the female trainee by the graduate student, you see that those people who had the personality characteristics that are in favor of or more likely to sexually harass are strongly interacting with the trainee in a sexist kind of way, whereas the low sexist scoring individuals did not change their behavior. So the takeaway message here is if a person already has an inclination to harass and then they find themselves in an environment that seems to encourage or tolerate harassment, then their behavior is very much sexually harassing. So this is all part of a study that was used by the American Psychological Association to argue at the Supreme Court, actually, to reduce what we call sexually hostile workplaces. So in an environment where sexuality and sexual harassment of women is tolerated, then we see that this sort of behavior is much more likely, and therefore, in order to better protect women in the workplace, we have decided to as a society, reduce the amount of sexuality and sexual joking and sexual context in the workplace. This is why we don't see bikini calendars anymore at people's places of work, and we don't tolerate sexist jokes and those kinds of things. And UAA has recently gone through a Title IX training to remind us of these things, so you're probably acutely aware of that in the semester in particular. Now, when we talk about institutions, we should also be thinking about institutionalized discrimination. Institutionalized discrimination is built into the legal, political, economic, or economic institutions of a culture. And they might be quite direct and obvious. For example, if there's military rules requiring the expulsion of openly homosexual soldiers, or before that, if there were military rules not allowing women to be in the military or women to be in particular roles of the military, those would be institutional discrimination. They can also be more indirect and subtle. For example, if corporations are hiring those with quote-unquote better educations and that excludes some minorities and favors others, then that's a problem and it's subtle. And I put better in quotation marks here because sometimes better means more expensive when in fact the curriculum or the credentials that a person has earned at, say, a public school are not any better or any inferior to that might be achieved at a more expensive private school. So what are some of the material costs of prejudice, stereotyping, and discriminations? Here's some examples. Physicians were only 60% as likely to suggest top-rated diagnostic tests for black heart patients as compared to whites. So imagine you go into your doctor expecting to have the same kind of health care and the same kind of health advice as anyone else, and you're paying your bill, and yet in this study it indicates that African Americans were actually less likely to receive the same kind of advice as whites. This is even when blacks presented the exact same symptoms and gave identical information about themselves as compared to the whites. Now here's an example of another kind of cost. One study found that white men were offered better deals on cars, and specifically $109 less than white women, $318 less than black women, and $935 less than black men. So I guess the message here, even though this is a fairly old study, is if you're a black man or a black woman, maybe you should get a white man in to go and negotiate your car price. Or more importantly, I guess you should go in and say, look, social psychologists have found that you're likely to be biased against me, so here's why you're going to give me a good deal. Another cost that's much more psychological is the feeling of being a token minority in a group. That can lead to feelings of self-consciousness that can be distracting, and in particular that distraction can cause us to perform less well on tasks that require concentration. Now I would encourage you to have a look at the video type on stereotype threat. I believe that's in the websites of the week. And if not, you can ask me about where to find one. I'm fairly certain that it's there in the websites of the week. It's quite interesting. It's by Claude Steele, a social psychologist at Stanford University, and he really has some interesting work there about how worrying about being a member of a stereotype group can actually throw a person off pretty badly and actually lead to some confirmation of those stereotype beliefs that people may have. So stereotype threat is a related phenomenon, and that's when people will, because of a long-term experience, negative experience with other people's stereotypes about their groups, may disidentify with those areas, arenas rather, where society expects them to fail. So if society expects that white men can't jump, for example, and that they won't do so well on the basketball court, then maybe some tall, moderately talented white basketball players may decide that their career of college or professional basketball is really not for them because, after all, white men can't jump. So disidentification is to decide that an arena is no longer relevant to their self-esteem. I decide not to pursue my goal of becoming a white basketball player because I'm just concerned that I won't be able to achieve, and I don't want that to hurt my self-esteem, so I disidentify. That's the basic idea. Another one that's related to the stereotype threat video that's online is that women and girls may decide to disidentify about math and science for the similar kinds of reasons. So go ahead and have a look at that video. I think you'll enjoy that. It's quite interesting. So shifting gears here somewhat, we might ask ourselves why people engage in stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And probably the most important concept that social psychologists have investigated is this idea of mental efficiency. And we brought it up earlier in the course, but we're returning to it here. And that's the idea that it's often quite difficult and time-consuming to think in a very cautious and careful way about every social decision that we face in daily life. And thus people take mental shortcuts, they seek ways of being efficient with their mental resources, and sometimes that leads to simplified processing of social information and relying on stereotypes when we could do a little bit more careful job of thinking about the individuals that we encounter. So let's look at that first idea, seeking mental efficiency. The metaphor that's often used is King Miser. King Miser is the guy who hoarded up all the gold and wouldn't share it So when we talk about a cognitive miser, we're talking about a person who is stingy with his or her mental resources and only uses them. And so the cognitive miser uses mental shortcuts or heuristics in order to save time and effort in decision making. And stereotyping is a process of categorizing an individual as a member of a particular group and then inferring that he or she will possess the characteristics generally believed to be held by members of that group. Doing that is so much easier than having a detailed interview with each person that you encounter in a new way. So let's say you are let me think of an example. Let's say you meet a teenage girl and you just assume that she, and maybe you're trying to buy a birthday. You know, she's a distant relative and you're visiting your aunt or uncle, and she's a cousin that you've never met before, and she's a lot younger than you are, but she's a member of the family, and you have to buy a gift. And so you decide to buy her some music that is popular with teenage girls these days. Okay, and you do this based on the stereotype about your expectations about what young girls like for popular music. And it turns out that this is a lot easier than having a detailed conversation with her and learning based on some long conversation about what types of music that she likes. So if you've kind of took a shortcut and decided that a gift that would be appropriate for her is the same kind of gift that many teenage girls like in the way of musical entertainment, then that would be using a cognitively miserly approach, kind of a shortcut or heuristic, instead of getting a detailed understanding of what this individual is like. Now, you could have been off with your teenage cousin friend. You might have been wrong in assuming that she likes Taylor Swift, for example, and you bought that Taylor Swift CD for her, or you might have gotten it wrong. Maybe unlike many teenage girls who likes Taylor Swift, maybe she's really into I don't know, Elvis Presley, something that you wouldn't really expect. But in the former case, let's say you guessed it right, that she actually kind of likes Taylor Swift, as do many teenage girls. That would be what we call a kernel of truth. Many people use stereotypes because although some are badly inaccurate, occasionally when we apply it to a particular individual, it may not be accurate. Nonetheless, many stereotypes contain a kernel of truth. I mean, if we were to do a poll of young women from age 13 to, 17, we might find that the majority of them do like Taylor Swift. And that kind of guess was an informed guess, and it was, more or less likely to be true. Not necessarily going to be true, but more likely to be true than not. And that's what we mean by a kernel of truth. So another example is that students who are asked rarely get the direction of actual sex differences wrong, but they sometimes overestimate them. So for example, if men and women compared on spatial ability, spatial reasoning, there's a minor difference between the genders there, and men are favored in that difference. So they're actually unlikely to say, oh, well, women are better at spatial reasoning than our men. But what they do is tend to exaggerate the extent of that difference. And so on the next slide we see here another example, aggressiveness. It's the case that males tend to be somewhat more aggressive than females, physically aggressive in particular. But the stereotype over here on the right shows that people tend to exaggerate the difference. So here we have, if we looked at the kind of the center of this hump on the reality side, we're seeing that there are some differences, but a lot of overlap between men and women. So these women here are just as aggressive, if not more aggressive, than the average guy. But the stereotype pushes people further apart in terms of their average and also acknowledges less degrees of overlap. So if you're comparing this reality to this stereotype, you'll see that the differences are more extreme with the stereotype and that there's less overlap between men and women, or the two different groups that are being stereotyped. So the stereotypes sometimes can be useful in terms of saving us time and effort, but we are likely to get it wrong sometimes because the reality is more complicated, more subtle than the stereotype. Another thing that we acknowledge in stereotype processing is perceived outgroup homogeneity. This is the phenomenon of overestimating the extent to which members within other groups are similar to one another. So when we look at a different group, we tend to think of them as all alike or very similar to one another. And then when we look at our own group, we tend to think of them as more different, more diversified within our own group. So men, when you think about women, you think women are all like X, Y, and Z. And you think about men, and men are actually not all that simple. They're complicated. And then when you flip that around, women, if you think about men, you think about them in more simpler and similar kinds of ways, and you think about your own group in very diverse ways. They are all alike, we are different and varied. So the last couple of slides here, we're going to look at one of the methods that social psychologists use to explore stereotypes. So what we're talking about here is a cognitive focus. We're talking about the automatic activation of stereotypes, and we're returning to a concept that we introduced earlier in the course, and that is priming. When we hear the word bread, it primes for many people associations with the idea of bread, which includes butter and sandwiches, etc. Okay, so we have these associations with bread, and they're mental associations. It's based on our learning history. It's based on semantic associations between concepts. Now, similarly, even non-prejudiced people have not automatic associations that are linked to racial stereotypes. So even if you try hard not to be a prejudiced person, if you don't discriminate, you may nonetheless be aware of stereotypes, and when you're primed, you may have those automatic associations light up in your consciousness. So these can be activated without conscious awareness, and for example, you can be subliminally primed by having certain words flashed on a computer screen, and then that will get you thinking about associated thoughts and feelings within those stereotypes. So for example, students in this one experiment were making rapid decisions about words that were stereotypically associated with blacks, for example, musical or athletic, and they recognized these words more rapidly if subliminally primed with the word black as compared to subliminally being primed with the word white. In contrast, they recognized words such as educated more rapidly if subliminally primed with the word white. So if you want to get a better sense of that study, it is by Kawakami, Dion, and Dovidio in 1999. And let me see if I can get that actually on the screen for you here. Just going to see if I can type it into the screen there for you. Oop. Did that work? Duh, there it is. Okay, so yeah, if you wanted to have a look at that study, which is quite interesting, it's there, Kawakami, Dion, and Dovidio, and it's quite an interesting study. Make that a little smaller here. Anyway, that concludes lecture 21, and I'll get the other lecture up here in short order. Thank you. Oops.